got to kind of a critical part of the project here. I am wet sanding the truck to prepare it for paint. Now, there's a lot of different schools of thought on wet sanding, and there's as many different ways to wet sand as there is painters. Now, this truck has already been blocked dry with 320, and it's straight, to the best of my knowledge. It's as straight as I can make it without going totally insane. And it is a truck. It's not a Maserati, it's not a Bentley, it's not a Ferrari, it's not a Lamborghini, it's not a custom car, it's my truck. So while I do want it to be as smooth and as straight as humanly possible, I'm not killing myself trying to make it straight. Now the doors and the quarter have already been blocked out. I decided that I was going to do it with 600 wet. And there's a lot of different schools of thought on this also. So I could have gone up to 600 dry and then went over it with 800 wet. I could have just gone over it 600 dry and been done with it. If I had kept to my original plan was to DA it out with 320 dry and paint it. And there are parts of the truck that I am doing that to. The roof and below this belt line here, that bucket's in the way. And below this belt line, or the style line here, are not getting sanded any further with wet. They're not getting wet sanded. The most I might do with it is hit it with Scotch-Brite and cleanser because it's getting Raptor line. But the tops of the doors between, the tops of the doors themselves and between here and here are getting wet sanded with 600. Now, I'm using 3M. We're gonna get to that in a second. I'm using 3M 600 wet dry. This is gold, A weight. I'm using copious amounts of water. Now, you didn't see it. Well, you saw me drop something, and what I dropped was this intermediary pad. When you're wet sanding, the most important part, and I cannot emphasize this enough, the most important part of wet sanding is making sure that everything is clean, everything stays clean. The first thing I did was I got a brand new bucket because I'm fancy. Now they do make sanding buckets that have little trays in them, so your sandpaper doesn't hit the bottom of the bucket because that's where all the trash and shit gathers. I never use those, but what I did use was I used to use 3-gallon pickle buckets instead of a 5-gallon bucket. Mainly because you don't want to stick your arm all the way into the bottom of a 5-gallon bucket if you can use a 3-gallon bucket. The other thing that I do is I have the hose. I have a freshwater hose right here, which I may actually end up putting a filter on because the municipal water here has a lot of minerals in it and has a tendency to spot when it dries, and those spots will show through when you go to paint the truck, trust me. Another thing is you'll see this dried sanding sludge here on the fender and then on the door. That's bad. That all has to be scrubbed off and possibly sanded back off. So you don't want that to dry on there. One of the other many things, so here's my intermediate pad, and I've got 3 blocks in the bucket here, and these are all were washed before they were put in the bucket, thoroughly washed. So what I've got is, I've got a stiff, oh, and there is soap in the water, just a little tiny bit. It's Dawn dishwashing detergent, the stuff they use to clean the little ducks with, because that stuff will strip any oil out, and actually the oils from your hands, it'll help wash those away also. You don't need no lotion, you don't need whatever. You don't want anything on your body that's going to impact the paint. So no hand lotion, no jerking with the Jergens for the day ahead of time unless you wash your hands. You want to be clean. No eating fried chicken before you paint a car. God is my witness. I worked with a guy that literally ate fried chicken for lunch, painted a car, and it fish-eyed like nothing you'd ever seen. Or greasy hamburgers or whatever greasy food that you were eating. Wash your hands after you eat lunch. So I have this DuraBlock here, which is this is pretty stiff, but it's not the stiffest block I have, but it is pretty stiff. I have an intermediary pad or intermediate pad. Now these this one's actually pretty well used. Now I have two more of these. I've got a brand new one, and I've got probably 10 of these. They come in a 10 pack, and each one is at a different state of wear. This particular one I chose because of its state of wear. The corners are nice and worked down. All the corners are worked off of it. It's this is a nice pad for what I'm doing right now. A regular hard black squeegee, in case I run across a run or a booger or a low spot or something, or a real high spot, something that I need a real stiff leveler. Okay, I'll use this one because this one, the soft one, and this one, the semi-rigid one, are not rigid enough to take out an imperfection like that. These are designed basically to glide over the surface. This booger will really whack crap out of it. Also, be careful that this has embossed on one side and smooth on the other. Always make sure you sand with the smooth side. And also with these, when they're brand new out of the box, sand all the edges. You can also use this to clean the water off in between. I also use one of these. This is a window washer squeegee. You got to be careful with these because you could scratch a car with them. But it does big wide areas at one time. And it does a really good job. And I have this block. This is the same DuraBlock that I used to block it out with when I blocked it the first time. I washed it very thoroughly. I removed all the adhesive. This thing is as smooth as it's ever been or it's ever going to be. I might use this on the hood. I might not. I threw it in the bucket just to see how it blocks out. The process that I'm doing right now, the 600 wet sanding, is more of a remove sanding scratches and do a final inspection on the bodywork. 600, while it will fair a surface, it's generally not aggressive enough to straighten a surface. There's a fine line between fairing and straightening. The 600 wet on an intermediary block or intermediate block will take out the occasional gouge here and there, which I'm going to come across. Another thing I should mention is that I guide coated the truck again after blocking it with the 320. I blocked it with 320. I went over it with my DA with the intermediary pad, the real soft pad, and then now I'm going back over it again with the 600 wet. I use this bottle to put water on with because I have a lot of control over it. They make, and I actually had, I don't have them anymore, sprayers to flush the surface. Okay, so when you're sanding with water, what you're doing is you're flushing away all the imperfections or all the sanding sludge, for the sake of argument. I don't use the sprayers anymore because they're messy. Wet sanding's messy enough as it is. There's nothing worse than getting jungle rot in your feet or your boots rotting off because all you do is stand in water and wet sand all day. Another thing that's really vitally important to remember is you only want to keep one grade of sandpaper in your bucket at any given time. I had a couple little spots that I had to hit real quick that I missed with the DA that I used 400 on. Now 400 is actually very good for fairing the surface. If you wanted to block the whole thing out wet with 400, guide coat it again, go back over it with 600, go over it with 800 and paint it. I'm not going to go over it with 800. I got to draw the line somewhere. And with my professional experience, is anything over 600 is kind of it's a little bit of a waste, especially with a truck. It's just you'll get a finer finish, you will, but this truck is going to get the wet sanded. It's going to get a coat of color appropriate sealer, a dark gray sealer. Then it's going to get 2 or 3 coats of base coat, and then it's going to get 2 or 3 coats. Actually, it's going to get 3 or 4 coats of clear. So there's a considerable amount of film thickness going on with that. And with that considerable amount of film thickness, you want to have you want to make sure you have pretty good mechanical adhesion. And my personal opinion is anything over 600 is a waste. That's just my personal opinion. Just like wet sanding, just like bodywork, just like painting, everybody's got an asshole and everybody's got an opinion, and they all are different. You can do it however you want. This is how I'm doing it. The nice thing about doing it this way with the wet sanding and the intermediate pad is it separates your hand from the panel, so you don't end up with any finger fucks or assholes sanded in it unless you do it on purpose. So this piece of 400 is going to go over here. Another thing that you kind of, I've heard so many different opinions on this one particular subject is the sandpaper itself. So I don't know if it's going to show up on video. My clothes are clean too, by the way. So if you can see here, I don't know if it's going to show up. Yeah, I don't think it's going to show up. If you compare the two pieces of paper, this is a brand new fresh piece of paper that I haven't used yet, and this is the one I've been sanding with for a while. You'll notice that there's, well, if you could see it in person, there's a saturation to the paper. The water saturates into the paper, and it creates a softer, more pliable, supple paper. Now, I was taught that when you're sanding, you want to put all your paper in the bucket at one time. Actually, what you might want to do is put the paper in the bucket the night before to allow the paper to become thoroughly and fully saturated with water. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. That's just one of those. That's what I was told. When I was wet sanding and polishing a lot of cars, I would actually do that. The night before, if I painted a car, I did a panel or whatever, the night before, or that night, I would get my sanding bucket ready. I'd put water in the sanding bucket, I'd cover the bucket, I'd throw the sandpaper in there, I'd throw all my tools in there and let them get thoroughly saturated with water. The next morning I would come in, I'd wash the paper, I'd wash the buckets, and I'd fill everything back up, and then I would start wet sanding for polishing. And then I've done it the other way. I've come in the morning, thrown the paper in the bucket, and sanded and polished the car. I never noticed a difference, really. The one guy that I worked for swore by it. You had to do it. If you didn't do it, you weren't doing it right. But then again, I never did anything right to him. So, yeah, it's a total toss-up, and you can do it either way. So I'm going to do a little bit of sanding just to kind of show what I'm doing. I'm not going to video the whole thing. I've blabbered enough. You've seen one guy sand a car. You've seen 1,000 guys sand a car. It's all the same shit. I am going to move the camera in just a little bit and try to get a better shot of exactly what I'm doing here. So I hope it shows up on camera. This isn't the greatest camera in the world. So I sanded it here. Now you can see there's variations in the color, and the variation in the color here is where I've sanded through the one coat of primer into another coat of primer, and that's okay. What you want to do is you want to avoid sanding into bare metal. If you get into bare metal, then you got a problem. And another note is, you'll see I put a tire cover on here. Now I put that tire cover on there because the sanding sludge is pervasive. It doesn't like to wash off. And then one thing it definitely doesn't like to wash off of is tires and wheels. So anything that you don't want sanding sludge on, you really should protect it from sanding sludge. And you don't want sanding sludge on anything if you can avoid it. I've talked about it before, but it bears to be reiterated. Try not to lean on anything overly hard. The tops of these fenders in particular will take a dent. The old Fox body Mustangs were famous for it. You would lean on the top while you were sanding it, and you'd put palm prints. Now the other thing I've got going on here is I've got this wet rag in between this bottle and what I'm sanding. I do that for a couple reasons. One is it keeps the rag right handy, because you're always going to be wiping, and it keeps the bottle from rolling away. Sometimes it'll roll away. If the bottle hits the ground, if the rag hits the ground, stop what you're doing, take it to the wash sink and wash it out thoroughly. Not your bucket. Okay, don't put it back in your sanding bucket. Same goes with the sandpaper. Same thing goes with the intermediate pad. If you drop it on the ground, which you're inevitably going to do, take your bottle and wash it off away from the car. If you don't do that, the chances of you picking up shit from the floor and then grinding it into your paint job are about 100%. Unless you're working in the nicest, cleanest paint shop on the face of the earth, there is shit on the floor that will get into your paint job. Now, when I'm sanding this, especially at this point, I am cross-hatching just like I would normally for a blocking, but you'll notice that I'll occasionally change directions, and the reason I do that is you want to cross-hatch, so you want to go this way and then you want to go this way. But every once in a while, especially when you get to this level of sanding, you'll see a spot that's just not acting right, and you're going to need to sand that. And if by cross-hatching you're not getting it, then you kind of have to punt a little bit and break the rule and go along this way. You'll also see that I'm kind of dripping the water on the rag a little. That's just kind of like another layer of filtering this water, which needs to be clean. Always needs to be clean. Always clean. I cannot stress cleanliness enough. Now I'm taking this intermediary pad too, and I'm bending it. This goes back to the soft and supple paper. Paper will get creased. Okay, and those creases will show up in your final finish. It will. So you have to be careful. You don't want any sharp folds in your paper. You want to make sure you don't catch this edge. So this edge is pretty soft. So these edges are soft now. A fresh piece of paper will have a sharp edge, and that sharp edge will show up. If you go like with that sharp edge, you're going to have a line there. This primer is pretty soft. This high build is fairly soft, and it's had way too long to cure. Now I do this with headphones on, just because I've been doing it for so long. I actually have been doing this particular type of work for so long that I can feel through my hand and through this intermediary pad how the paper and the pad are reacting to the surface that I'm sanding. I know that sounds very I don't want to say facetious, but it sounds smug, I guess would be a good way to put it. To say that I've been doing this so long I don't need to hear what I'm doing. I can feel it. I know by the way the paper feels through my hand how it's sanding. Now I am watching too. I'm watching very carefully. Sanding is an oddly mindless task, but requires a certain level of intensity in your paying attention to what you're doing. You can destroy a paint job almost instantly by screwing this part up. Any flaws from this point forth in the job will show up in your final result, and that's part of why I'm doing what I'm doing. That video didn't turn out the way I had wanted it to. The camera had quit recording and I didn't know it, so I just kept babbling like an idiot. And by the time I realized that the camera was out, I was already done sanding. I also can't seem to find the footage of me taping it up, thoroughly taping it up. I thought I had shot some. At the time I was in more of a rush to get the car painted than I was to shoot video, so I apologize for that.